Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Everybody knows it's Words and Numbers. Why do I say that every week? It makes about as much sense as what I'm going to say next. What's new and exciting in your world this weekend?
You and I talk about how markets are wondrous things and they give people what they want. I ran across a company, and for reasons that will become obvious in a moment, I'm not going to say what the company is. But it sells face masks, you know, the kind that we have to wear in the age of COVID. Let me read you from the front page of its website here. These are attributes of their masks. Maximum airflow and breathability, does not trap heat and moisture, minimizes buildup of germs, will not muffle speech, and here's the big one for me, will not fog eyeglasses.
How much are they asking? Because I'm going to pay whatever they want.
It's about $20. Except here's the thing. If you go through that list of things I just read you, there should be something glaringly obvious that's missing.
I got nothing.
Nowhere does it say anything about it filtering out the germs.
Well, I think we all kind of know that that's not exactly what happens anyway.
If you dig a little bit into their website, they have notice. Our mask is not designed nor intended to prevent, mitigate, treat, diagnose, or cure any disease or health condition, including COVID-19.
Isn't that a kick in the pants right there?
They designed these things. In fact, one of the things in the FAQ, when it asks which of your various masks should I get, and it has a thing that if you're going to be on airlines, here's the one that you want that looks most realistic and yet does nothing.
I've actually been thinking about this business possibility for 6 months now, but I couldn't quite figure out how to make a fabric that actually didn't do anything.
It didn't do anything. Right. For $20, I wanted to do nothing.
And that is the goal, right? We would like to feel more comfortable.
We're about to go back to school for the spring semester, and this has just been hellacious. I can't wear my glasses because, of course, the thing fogs up. I can't see the students, the expressions on their faces. I can't see their mouths, so I have no idea what they're saying, and they have no idea what I'm saying. So we kind of just spend the 50 minutes looking at each other saying, what? What?
Well, let's not forget how deaf you are.
That's right.
You were doomed to that eventuality anyway. I was fully expecting that we'd finally be back to normal as of the new year. You know, the new strain, this Omicron strain, everybody's losing their minds, but I don't know anybody who's all that sick with it.
No.
Every report I hear anecdotally indicates that this is not the Walking Dead when you get this. It's unpleasant. You'd rather not have it. You know, that's true of a lot of things. And all those other things don't keep me from going places and doing my business.
Meanwhile, kids, particularly younger kids, are having a heck of a time. I have a good friend whose daughter is having severe depression problems about going back to school because of the whole masking business and the social distancing and all of this. And beyond the hassle associated with this, she's become terrified because it's been this constantly nonstop for 2 years. Oh my God, you have to do this, otherwise you're going to drop dead.
I say this all the time with the various things that can kill you. How many people do you know who died falling out of a tree? Almost none or none, right? How many people do you know who were murdered with a knife? Again, none. How many people do you know who died of heart disease?
Yeah.
Oh, now we're talking. Now it's every person I know who died.
Everybody over an age of X, right?
Yeah, it's an easy diagnostic tool to use to see if maybe we're making too much of something. Because if you don't know a bunch of people who died of COVID, there are probably other things to be much more fearful of.
Yeah, and I would have tread lightly on that statement prior to the vaccine. But now that there's the vaccine plus the booster and most people have it, yeah, I think you're right.
In New York Magazine, the headline, "Who's Afraid of Price Controls?" Here we go. The piece was written by Eric Levitz, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Mr. Levitz's degree is in, you got a guess?
Sociology? English.
That was my guess too. Wait, also my second guess. We hung out a little too long together. Turns out, yes, he's trained in literature.
Okay.
That's the dude who New Yorkers will look to for guidance as to whether we should have price controls. Not surprisingly, his answer is yes.
I'm just astounded at the sequence of events here. The government spends money it doesn't have, which necessitates the printing of money, which leads to inflation. Politicians then say, well, the cause of the inflation are these greedy companies raising their prices, and the solution is price controls.
It is beautifully circular. These people are out of their minds.
Let's take the opportunity here to tell everybody what the next two steps of that sequence will be. If indeed
we already know, and we've been predicting it for quite some time.
If indeed we get price controls, you will then see shortages. And you will then hear politicians saying that the shortages are deliberate on the part of the companies to punish us for these price controls, and we now need legislation to force them to bring product to market.
Which means you're going to force them not to make a profit, which means they'll all go out of business. If you have any doubt, go check out what happened in Venezuela. We've talked about this before. They got all the way to the point in price controls where there was no more food. And when there's no more food, they collect all of the Venezuelans who are out of work, put them on a truck, drop them off at the farms and say, now you'll work here.
Yep, they force them to work.
Price controls lead inevitably to slavery.
I wouldn't say price controls, but I think it's this sequence of intervention and then intervention to fix the problems and then intervention to fix those problems. And the only place you can end up is at mandated labor, where the government tells you you must go out and work.
And if you want an analogy, think about that cartoon where the cat eats the fish and the dog eats the cat, ... whale.
And when you get to the end of that sequence, you've long forgotten the original cause. And the original cause was the government spending money it doesn't have.
Every time you say there ought to be a law or government should do this, well, what are you going to get? This. I read a story today in the New York Post about an Australian man who doused himself with gas and lit himself on fire as he ranted about COVID vaccines.
Good Lord.
How did we get here? Now, I'm going to just conclude that this guy wasn't doing so well in the first place. Right? There's an obvious problem here. But when you get to the point where people are lighting themselves on fire in protest of something, maybe you should take a step back and think about it a little bit more.
And when's the last time there was somebody in the news lighting themselves on fire? What level of hardship were we dealing with? We were dealing with the Vietnam War.
That's right. You've got the Vietnam War, and you've got the act that set off the Arab Spring.
Yes.
I've often complained to you about the Harrigan family vacations that I am forced to take. And this year, God help me, I'm driving 2 children and a dog and a wife to Burbank, California. Who wants to go to Burbank? Exactly no one.
Right, they're all leaving.
That's right. And I had to figure out what kind of proof I need to bring to California that they'll even let us in.
I have so many questions here. You're talking what, like an 12-hour trip?
8 hours.
With a dog in the car?
A dog in a dog kennel in a car.
In the dog kennel, in the car. And for those of you, because this is audio, James' dog is quite large.
No, she's not. That's just mean-spirited. She's about 45 pounds.
Yeah, Molly's not a yippy dog by any means.
Oh, no, she doesn't fit into a man purse, I'll say that.
All right, so there's question number 1. Now, question number 2, which is on all of our minds, why, for God's sake, are you going to Burbank?
I don't know.
You just said, okay, I'm going.
I am never allowed to know why these things transpire. I'm just going there. And look, we have taken family vacations to places like, rural Kansas. There's just no explaining any of this.
Well, I know your wonderful wife does enjoy, I understand this, looking for things out of the ordinary. She found the world's largest potato chip at one time.
It was actually a potato crisp. Let's not get carried away here. There was also the visit to the Museum of Clean, which was run by a guy, and you had to call him at home so he'd come over and open it up.
Open it up. Was it clean or just a museum of?
I was not.
You didn't participate.
To be on that particular excursion. No. Nor did I see the world's biggest ball of twine.
I'd see that.
I don't know why anybody needs to see. No, you won't.
So I wonder what the biggest, smallest, largest, loudest, whatever it is in Burbank is.
Oh, we'll know next week. I'll tell you all about it. If you hear an episode after this one, I lived through it.
So certainly they don't require papers of any sort to enter the state.
I doubt it, but they could, because there are border checks on every road into California.
You're kidding me. Really?
No, it's to check for produce if you have fruits and vegetables. And they make you pull up, and if you have any fruit or vegetable matter, they make you give it over and they throw it away.
Huh.
Something about fruit flies, if memory serves. Anyway, they have this check at every point on the border, and then they've got, of course, the checks all over the Mexican border. So they could actually tighten things right up if they wanted to. I'm a little more concerned with what kind of paper I need to show people to go to whatever terrible museum I have to go to. Oh, you'll like this. One of the museums I have to go to does contain all of the old Star Trek exhibits.
Oh, superb.
I won't like it, but I can make fun of you that you didn't get to see it.
No, I did. There used to be a Star Trek museum in Las Vegas. I've been several times.
Yep, it was in Vegas.
Yep.
Apparently they've moved most of that stuff over to this other place, and the DeLorean from Back to the Future and Batman's car and things like this.
If it's the same as what was at Las Vegas, for an extra fee, I don't know what it is, $10, $15, you can walk onto a replica of the Bridge of the Enterprise. I highly recommend it. Is worth the extra $10, $15. Go and do it.
Well, we'll see how that all goes later, but for now, I think I've reached my limit on the things that irritate me, and we're just going to have to go.
I hope you document this, like your Yelp reviews.
A lot of people seem to recall with great fondness my blow-by-blow description of what happened on my 1 megabus trip from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh. I do think that maybe this can replicate that.
Yes.
It's that ridiculous on its face. So we'll see how it goes.
Excellent. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible.
Mikhail Rasner joins us this week. Mikhail is president of Mir United, a transport brokerage company. Mikhail's company handles 10% of the brokered transport business coming into the port of Los Angeles. We invited him to Words and Numbers to give us an insider's view of what's going on with supply chain problems. Mikhail is a particularly special guest in that he's a long-term fan of Words and Numbers and a former student of mine at Duquesne University. Mikhail, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate you both.
As I understand it, you're the middleman between the trucking company and the manufacturer, so goods that come into this country, you're the one who sets up what happens between there and the goods getting on a truck to go to wherever they belong. Is that more or less describing what you do?
Yeah, that's a great way to formulate essentially where we stop and start. We do take it so far as even final mile and shelf life. We take it as early as origin, which is from the very beginnings of manufacturing out of Ningbo and helping move it all the way to this country. But the essence of being the middle person in between the mobility and the manufacturer final client is basically what we are.
Can you lay out for our listeners the whole process? From my perspective, someone who doesn't know anything about shipping, I buy something that's made in China, and in my mind, the manufacturer ships it to the U.S. That verb, ship, covers a whole bunch of moving parts. Could you break down a little bit what are those moving parts?
And let me go a step further. I actually think it's magic. I look at something, it's from China or India, and somehow miraculously it ends up in a shopping cart. Take the magic away and put real world things in its place.
You may be one of the only people that isn't in our business that describes it that way, especially with the marketplace that we're dealing with now. It feels almost like magic in a lot of times that we're able to do this. It is a cumbersome process. The order starts from the purchaser. It could be a company that's making a major purchase like a Boeing. It could be something as small as like C&B Toys, which is a small mom and pop store that we have here in St. Louis. They'll make the purchase. And that manufacturer, it could be in China, it could be in India, Taiwan. That seems to be the majority of the places where a lot of this stuff comes from. We have an internal forwarder that works with us. She helps run everything from origin, which is overseas. She helps put together the customs brokerage, the crossing documents. Once the product is ready to ship, they will then use actually a ton of calculus to find the optimum placement for it in one of their thousands of containers, because there's not enough to fill a whole container typically. So fill parts of it with other clients, and then they'll label it, come back to us, give us some information, and we'll have it shipped over to the States.
When you say container, you mean a shipping container, one of those huge things that you see on the backs of trucks.
Yep.
So I guess if you're a big manufacturer, a big shipper, you can fill one of those. If you can't, you got to share space with somebody else?
Yes.
Okay, so that thing is filled up, however it's filled up. It's on the ship in China, and now it comes here. What happens when it gets here?
Well, hang on. What happens on the way? How long does that trip take?
Well, tender times from China, obviously, depending on which port you decide to go to. LA is typically about 23 to 27 days. Miami's a good bit tougher than that. You're going closer to the 40 days. Though if you're shipping from China, you're usually going to the Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, Vancouver, Oakland, or LA markets. Vice versa, if you're shipping from the European side, you're probably going New York, Charlotte, Tampa, Miami, Jacksonville, etc. James, what happens on that boat, honestly, nobody can actually tell you. When we have clients that are not quite as understanding, they'll ask us, hey, do you know where in the sea is our container? And politely, we'll make a joke out of it and say, well, do you want longitude and latitude, or how would you like me to deliver this information?
Hopefully on the surface, right?
Right.
Right. As far as we know, it hasn't fallen in. Tender times do take quite a bit, and especially with what's happened due to some of the supply chain frustrations that have exponentially increased lately, those tender times have nearly doubled. You would typically see a container from China to LA, like I said, in 23 to 27 days. It's closer to about 45 to 50 days now.
Wow.
So you've got a lot of stuff just sitting out at sea.
And so that extra 20-some days, that's what, waiting in line off the coast of Los Angeles?
One of the ports that it might be going to. There's obviously other ports that exist there, but it's few and far between on the West Coast.
I'm just trying to get my head around the cost. You've got, multi-hundreds of millions of dollar vessel, plus the crew, plus all of the cargo, just sitting idle for 20 days, simply because they can't get a space in the port.
And still everything that I buy that originates in China pretty cheap. So how does that happen?
You'll see a trend over the next couple of years that's going to shift away pretty heavily. China has made some moves that seem to correlate well with wanting to get out of the third world-like economy and more into the nicer side. I think COVID is a big push for that. I think they kind of realized that, hey, this business model being an extensive supply chain line because we're so cheap, I think they realized this might not be a sustainable model for them to move forward. The reason why they're able to make things so cheap, everything that they have is made in terms. So if they need anything, there's no shipping cost to getting it to them. Not anything for certain. Obviously, there's certain luxury goods that they tend to bring in. But even if it were something that wasn't necessarily a manufacturer of the U.S., they can get it from essentially down the street of Taiwan or India. They can have it shipped over from Australia, Japan. There's a lot of avenues that they have where the U.S. may not be so lucky.
I want to go back to this extra 20-day wait we're talking about. A friend of ours, Peter Earle, has recently written an article in which he says that under typical circumstances prior to COVID, there's basically not much of a wait at all. The ship comes across from China and it goes right to the port and unloads its stuff. And now we've got, a 20-day wait as, what are we talking? 50, 100 ships are backed up trying to get into the port? What's causing this?
Well, right now there's 92 ships that are sitting in line. And frankly speaking, there's not really any one thing that's causing this. It's quite an array of variables, and it starts well before COVID. The frustrations and the variables that have led to some serious congestion that is now so apparent that the media is reporting on it are really just a derivative of a lot of the frustrations that we've been facing, I would say, for the better part of 3 to 4 years now. I think the major one is the misalignment in incentives, in that the port's most major revenue stream is storage of containers. I laughed at it as well.
There's an incentive
What
problem.
could possibly go wrong?
This is kind of my soapbox. I could speak to this for hours. Part of why I'm really working hard to do what I can to change this world and to make it more apparent. But once a container is off that ship and is placed in a reasonable area, they give you 2 free days. After 2 free days, it's about $250 a day per container.
They're going to charge you that if your container's still sitting there after 2 days.
Every day.
And what's the capacity on the dock?
You're only supposed to stack containers 3 high. Let's use LA, for example. LA has 50% of every import that comes through the U.S. goes through that port. So we could probably backtrack and figure that out, but guessing, I'd say in the ballpark of 25 square miles.
Good Lord.
Wow.
Yeah,
Boy,
yeah.
those $250 charges stack right up, don't they?
Yes. And so if you look at the way the revenues come through, the amount that's being charged is just out of this world. As we know, these companies aren't just going to eat these charges. They're going to pass these costs on to the consumers on the back end when they do all the revising of the numbers, and when CFOs get numbers from transportation, they're going to throw their hands up in the air and say, what happened? And going to start figuring this out. Not specifically at LA, because they haven't mentioned it in a while, but if you look at the Chicago rail, one terminal off one rail in August made $12 million. That one terminal processes about 5,000 containers per month. And if you backtrack that math, that equals approximately $800 per container. $800 to $1,000 per container in fines. So that means every single container somehow missed 4 days worth of appointments. There's no earthly way that that could have been possible. The amount of capacity that's seeking to be put out there is extensive. Yesterday, I was on the phone with approximately 7 different people. It required me to keep moving up the ladder because I needed to pull one of my containers for one of my clients. If I didn't, we were going to be charged this money. And our company tend to run in a model where we actually will take on a little bit of that risk for them. And so the driver got there and he had an empty container that's sitting on his chassis and he needs to remove that and put this other one on. Well, they say, hey, sorry, we can't do this today. What do you mean you can't do this today? Well, we won't. If you have a different kind of container, we could do it, but this one we can't. There's no reason for this. We simply will not.
And this is their job. It's like my going to Walmart and them saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't sell you anything today. That's what you're in business for, right?
Exactly. And I mentioned it in a bit of a different way where I said something to the extent of, well, the White House and the administration is telling you guys that you have to do this. So I don't know how far up I need to take this, but can we please just get there now so we can start having that conversation? And thankfully, I seem to have gotten to somebody that was at least somewhat frustrated with the systems that we're playing with. And they got me to somebody, they got me to somebody else. They got me to the tower in Chicago. They got me to the manager, and the manager just went, oh, we can do this for sure. Just tell them to call for me when they get checked in.
Wow.
Serious.
So the product is on the ship. It comes from China to LA, where currently it just parks. It waits for 20-some days in line till it gets to the port where the containers are unloaded, and then that's where you come in.
Yep.
Assuming that they'll put the containers on the trucks you send there, the goods move out.
And that's even a problem out of LA right now. Biden opened up the port 24 hours, which probably unbeknownst to you guys was him opening up the port for an extra hour and a half a night. They are open from 6 a.m. until 4:30 a.m.
It sounded like a big deal when he said it.
By perspective, you would see that as a person and think, oh, great. We've certainly made some headway.
How is it that there are 100-odd ships, each of which is worth multi-hundreds of millions of dollars, sitting idle in the ocean off of LA, and we're not operating 24/7? How is that possible?
Yeah, I would agree with you 100% because one would think that there's not a place out there that wouldn't want supply chain to just move. Like, it's ordered, it's ready, it's paid for in a lot of cases. There are times when we get so far past when we ordered and the need for that product, like Black Friday. We have 1,000 different clients right now asking us to do what's called reverse logistics because they're about to destroy the container product.
So the first thing that would come to my mind as an economist is, if this is what's going on, if I own this multi-$100 million ship that's just sitting there, I'd go to a different port. Are you going to tell me that I don't have alternatives?
You do, but 70% of the ships are owned by one company. They lease the ships out to Maersk, MSC, Evergreen, so on and so forth. There's some other ships that are out there, but you may see the Air Terror or the Seacoast, the Ever Given, the one that's sideways into the canal in around the Middle East, owned by Hapag, actually. So most of them are just owned by the same company. Hapag also owns a lot of the terminal partners, so they just make money the entire time. So whether you pull the container out or store it, they're going to make more if you take more time. So let's say you redirect, which happens quite frequently. So redirect, if you're in LA, if you don't want to go to Mexico or Canada, your options are Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, which is really small. So you're talking virtually non-existent unless you've got a very, very small amount of goods. Vancouver, Washington, Oakland, LA. That's it. There's a small port in San Diego, which is part of the LA port. Port of Long Beach is part of the LA port. But that's it. So your options from there are you can redirect it. You can go through the canal and go up to Houston. You can take it to Alaska if you really wanted to do it that way. That's highly unadvisable. They're not congested at all, from my understanding, up there.
Think about ones that are close to L.A. You mentioned, well, I guess Oakland was the only one you mentioned in California. Then you got up at Washington State. Why aren't they diverting to places like that?
So they are. And then what's happening is they're getting filled. They're getting congestion. For example, like L.A. has 14 terminals to choose from. Oakland has 3. Seattle-Tacoma has 2. Portland has 1. So you've got virtually no space up there either. It's just pick of the litter. And as soon as they get congested, LA's kind of tends to ease off a bit, and you see some of the boats kind of come off that line, but right back at it. And that's exactly what happened over Black Friday. Is everybody just got very nervous. They started redirecting their ships across all the other terminals, all the other ports, and lo and behold, you saw a little of the congestion break up. But the day after Black Friday, within hours, all the work that was done to break that congestion up was pretty much doubled right back at it. So the congestion went from, at the time, I think there were 60 boats off of the coast. Now, like I was saying, it's 92.
At current trends, Mikhail, when do you suspect that this will be a thing of the past?
We're not even at, I would say, the quarter-way mark to how bad this congestion is going to get.
Oh, wow.
So all of this in play, we haven't even considered how misaligned the incentives are. We can probably identify that very quickly and what the unintended consequences look like there. We're not mentioning the fact that there was a major layoff that took place because they thought with COVID they were going to shut the ports down. It was at the same time as the $600 unemployment per week that came out. And port workers, they get a lot of really cool benefits, but longshoremen aren't paid very well. That $600 for the people that are doing a lot of the labor was huge, and it was more profitable for them to be unemployed. They continued to be unemployed, and they needed to bring new longshoremen in, which thankfully they're not short of that, but they're short of skill sets. It takes at least 2 years to truly operate the way that you want to, and efficiently, because they're crane operators, they're organizers, they're not simple workers. The duties may be blue collar, but the mine work that exists up in the port is pretty heavy. There's a major shortage of the capacity that they need to employ out there. I think there's something like 7,500 longshoremen that work on the LA ports. That's a third of what they need. But the union, especially in California, very heavy. They don't want people to come in. I think the line for the longshoremen's union is something like 210,000.
What do you mean the line? You mean people who are trying to be employed as longshoremen and the union's not letting them in?
Correct.
Wow.
Correct.
Well, playing off of that then, how much automation are they using? Is it possible that with better automation, they could get by with using fewer workers?
Yes and no. There are certain things that can be tracked a lot better, things that can be accounted for a ton better. I can't tell you how often this year we've driven into the port where we track our containers. There's an online way to do it. You go through the steamship lines websites, and oftentimes you can log in, you can see where they've placed the container, almost like a Dewey Decimal System for anyone that used to use that in the past. From there, we've had drivers come in and they can't find the container. So they go to this place, they're like, hey, this container's not there. So the driver goes to what's called the trouble room, and they just sit there. And they sit there until they come back to them, and maybe they find it, maybe they don't. But if they don't find it, then the driver's got to go home, and we'll figure it out when we figure it out. So if we had better tracing systems, we can probably become more efficient. They're claiming that there is a shortage of chassis, which there is to an extent. There's some pretty heavy shortage of the chassis, which for just our listeners that may not know as much, a chassis is like your trailer, whereas the container is kind of like the cargo for your 18-wheeler. So the import-export side, you bring a chassis into the port, they place the container on top like they would with a crane, and then you drive away. So what's happening is these drivers are being told to go away because they can't find these containers. They tell them to go away because they don't have a chassis available for them.
Wow.
Not every driver out there owns a chassis. So they go into the ports. They're supposed to have a pool there.
A pool of chassis.
Yeah. Apparently it's bare, which sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Your next question should be, why aren't people manufacturing chassis?
Right.
It's because there is a massive congestion in every carrier's yard because, and this should make you just question everything that's out there, the steamship lines refuse to accept empty containers. They've refused to do so for months and months now. We partnered with this really small company that just takes screenshots of available empty returns, and it's just blank all the time, just blank every day, all day. And so these carriers, these drivers, the empty container on the back of their chassis, they need to use this chassis to go pull another container, but they can't pull this chassis off because it's not like everybody just has a crane.
They can't take it off because no one will take the empty.
Correct.
Astounding.
Correct. It is mind-blowing, actually. So you have this massive congestion going on, and then you have your steamship line partners, and they're saying, well, we have all these available appointments. Why aren't the drivers coming in? And they'll take a picture of the lines. They'll say, it's an empty line. Anybody that wants to come in right now can come right through. Like, well, what are we going to be coming through with? We don't have space to put these containers in our yard. We don't even have the chassis to pick the container up. But hypothetically, let's even say we did. The clients don't have the space because they can't get rid of their own chassis. They went to pick the stuff up for. What we do is we're the overflow. We're after Walmart got all their truck drivers to go and pick stuff up. After they called some of their contacts to get it, then they call us. And we're called now more frequently than they do everything internally. So that should scream, we have no space anywhere. We need to get rid of this stuff immediately. And that's why I'm saying we're not even at the quarter-way mark. Unless there's just some mass entrance that LA just says, yeah, bring everything in right now. And I know that it is true that we could move all this stuff pretty quickly because I can't remember if it was the weekend of Thanksgiving or the weekend after. The TEU, which is, we'll say, an overseeing body to an extent, they came in and they said, hey, guys, your containers aren't supposed to be stacked 5 high. You're only supposed to stack 3 high. We're going to fine you for every single container out there that is over 3 high by $100. That weekend, they moved 24% of the containers out of the LA ports.
So it's magic again.
Yeah. It's so in your face at this point, it's very difficult to think how can one not have this glaring at them. And it's almost defeating at a certain point because you now think, okay, well, I mean, how much longer can this line trend? Most people don't share your opinion of the way that this magically kind of happens. Most people expect it to be there when the internet's set. Because it's not like everybody just has a crane. It should just be done that way. And unfortunately, that's the way clients and consumers still expect it. So we have to be there for the client. We have to be there for the consumer because supply chain's got to keep moving.
I want to go through this fascinating chain of causality. You've got the ships backed up because they can't move the containers off the ships fast enough at the port. Part of that is caused by the fact that they've got too many containers there, the space issues. But then that's caused by the fact that the truckers can't bring the containers out to their destinations. And that in turn is caused by the fact that the truckers have empty containers that no one will take off their hands.
Correct.
Okay. So let's go to the end of that chain. Why does nobody want these empty containers?
So I have a theory. It tends to leak into a little bit of the conspiracy side. So I certainly don't want this to be a representative of how I feel about most topics. However, I think in some part it's worth mentioning. We're going to have to explain this inflation. We're going to have to explain it pretty rapidly, in my opinion, over the next 2 to 3 years. Well, so you see the news right now that are coming out that are saying, oh, well, a spot for a container from India used to be $3,000 last year, and now it's $30,000. The average consumer, you see that and you think, oh, no, my stuff's going to cost 10x. What they obviously don't tell people is how many consumers are in one container, how the shared cost is applied, and so on and so forth. All they think is 10x, 10x. So when we come back and we say, wow, look at how well we've been able to curb inflation at only 6.8%. They're going to have to find some sort of scapegoat. And I genuinely think that logistics is going to be their primary when it comes down to it. They're going to have to say, look, consumers, we've done such a good job curbing this inflationary market while prices have gone up 10x for transportation. You should be lucky it's only 6.8%.
It's interesting because I also don't subscribe to conspiracy theories. However, I noted just today, I was seeing tweets from Elizabeth Warren talking about, well, the inflation's caused by the greed of the oil companies or the greed of the pharmaceuticals. And the latest was the greed of the grocery stores. Grocery store profit margins are like 1%. And it occurred to me, she's pointing to anything she possibly can that isn't the actual cause of the inflation, which is printing money.
They're smart enough to come up with enough reasons to get the blame. And look, it should be noted that transportation will certainly increase prices. I don't think that that would be a significant variable for the price increases.
I want to go back to James' question of how long are we dealing with this? You said we're a quarter of the way through. So what's your prognosis? A year, year and a half until everything's back to normal?
I foresee it possibly going in one of two ways. I think the extension of the supply chain out there, I think that's done. I think that for the past 30, 40 years, what we've been battling a lot of is who can extend their supply chain the furthest to minimize their costs and bring the goods in as much as possible. If you look at a lot of the major manufacturers right now, it seems like the trend is that they're bringing a lot of their supply chains back to the States. It seems like there's going to be a pickup in domestic manufacturing. So depending on what the balance is like between that and moving away from that world, I foresee it possibly getting curbed a little bit. And depending on what the costs and everything else look like, I see it getting curbed to some extent because we're going to increase production here. I think furthermore, it's going to take us the better part of another 2 years to find a cheap manufacturer from there. If you look at a lot of the trend lines, you're seeing a lot of negotiation and supply chains being brought into the African region, and especially a lot in Ethiopian region. If you actually look at Ethiopia's middle market right now, they're doing great. They're having an astounding year. So I think it's going to take approximately another 18 months from then to figure out what's going to happen and how we're going to ship from there. I think you're going to have your big box stores figure that out pretty quickly. I think you're going to have some of your other candidates get it done pretty well. Unfortunately, this industry I'm in doesn't necessarily bring in the best talent up front. It's a great industry for a startup job, and that's what a lot of people tend to treat it as. They don't treat it as a career. So the population that tends to take on a lot of the work are freshly graduated college students that really have hopes for something else. A lot of times they do their job, they make the phone calls, they get with their clients, but they may not have quite as much passion about building up this business as they do maybe about building up the skill set. So for me and my team, we're all about get the job done, execute. They may be a little bit more about, hey, I want to learn. Let's figure out how to make this mistake a few different ways, which is perfectly understandable and acceptable. We need to do that, but you see that trend. So you're going to see some other companies take a little bit longer to get there. If all that kind of balances out, I think we'll see about 20% more domestic manufacturing. That'll allow us to come out of this somewhat. But I think we're at least 2.5 to 3 years away before we get back to normal rates.
Well, this is fascinating because I've said the following words often. That with something as complex as an economy, you can't just shut it off and turn it back on, expect everything to work. But I kind of said that on faith, given that I understand it's a complex thing. But it's fascinating to hear some of the complexity that's going on behind the scenes and to really see that, you can't just shut it off and turn it back on and expect everything to work. Mikhail, thank you. This has been wonderful.
It's been really eye-opening. Thanks for giving us a little bit of your time.
It's my pleasure. I have to shout you guys out. This is genuinely my favorite podcast. Obviously I'm biased. Dr. Davies and I have known each other for well over a decade now, but it's more than that. I think what we're able to do is, and something that we don't get, really anywhere else it seems, is we're able to deliver, and I don't mean this to be punny, but we're able to deliver information in an execution where we're nice and we're timely. And it doesn't seem like there's ever information that's being delivered to make somebody have an emotional reaction. It's always about the actual information. And my is that refreshing because you get none of that, it seems. It's social media, and you get very few of that in person nowadays.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, and thanks now for being one of our contributors.
Yeah, Mikhail, thanks for the kind words. They're very, very appreciated.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you both.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, follow us on Twitter. Handles are, as always, in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. And
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
We'll see you next week when we've got something at least as interesting as this in the cards. And until then, be nice to each other. And I'll catch you later.
See you next week, James.